Hello, everybody. I am going to talk about the South after the Civil War, which is a huge topic. I'm not, I obviously can't cover everything here in this video, so please make sure you do all the reading. It's a lot of information and a very significant time in American history. Um, I'm not going to talk about Reconstruction. If you're not familiar with that, please watch American History Crash Course, the episode about Reconstruction. So just know, I'll kind of sum it up like this. After the Civil War, slaves were given basic freedom, and there were three main constitutional amendments that were passed to ensure this freedom. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment in the US Constitution, in many people's opinions, including mine. So the 14th Amendment was a milestone, and it said that every person born in the United States is a citizen, and every citizen has equal protection before the law. So I just kind of want to remind y'all, if you have kind of forgotten a lot of early American history, in 1857, there was a famous Supreme Court case, Dred Scott, the infamous Dred Scott case. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans cannot be citizens. They're not citizens and therefore have no constitutional rights. So the 14th Amendment overruled that Supreme Court decision, and it said, yes, African Americans are citizens, and therefore they do have equal protection before the law. So this is a huge milestone, really, in American political history. The problem is it wasn't at all enforced. We'll get back to that in a second. The 15th Amendment was another one of these Reconstruction amendments, and that guaranteed African American men the right to vote. That also did not get enforced. But for a brief time during the Reconstruction years, these three amendments were passed and things were sort of looking good, like we might actually make some progress. But the progress did not last long at all. So the amendments were passed in the 1860s and 1870s. By the 1880s, a lot of Southern whites had regained control of their state. So the amendments were forced on the Southern whites by the federal government. They had to change their state constitutions to include the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. In those Southern state constitutions, they had to agree to those amendments in order to end Reconstruction, in order to end the federal government's occupation of their states. So that happened around within the 1870s and 1880s, depending on which state. But after Reconstruction ended, which means the federal government stopped occupying Southern states, they removed troops from the South. When that happened, Southern states went back to doing things the way they wanted, which meant that they were not going to comply with these amendments. So starting in 1890, so 1890s are a very significant decade, as I'll say probably a few more times. Starting in 1890 with Mississippi, Southern states began to again rewrite their constitution. So Mississippi was the first, so it became called the Mississippi Plan. Mississippi rewrote their constitution to prevent African Americans from voting and to prevent equality before the law. So this is when they instituted racial segregation. Racial segregation did not start before the Civil War or immediately after. It started around the 1890s. And this is, I think, a common misconception. So for a brief period after the Civil War, African Americans made a lot of progress as far as winning certain political arguments that gave them more rights. African American men were being elected local political jobs. There was a mayor in Louisiana for a brief period of time who was African American, several congressmen, and a lot of other local political jobs. So African Americans were breaking into politics in the 1870s and 80s. By 1890, Mississippi said, no, no more. We are going to take back control of our state. These people who wanted to take back control of their state from the federal government and from African Americans, they were known as redeemers. And whenever they effectively squashed the Republican Party within their state, they declared that their state has been redeemed. So this is a good time to kind of talk about the differences between the parties. Try not to think of our current parties. The Democratic Party was the party of slavery. That was the party of the South prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War. They fought for slavery, states' rights, the state's right to own a slave, basically. The Republican Party was created in the 1850s, and their main platform was to stop the expansion of slavery, to prevent Western states from becoming slave states. That was kind of their main reason for forming as a party. So they were an anti-slavery party. And it's not to say that all of them wanted to abolish slavery in the 1850s. They just wanted to stop the spread of it. And Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. So the Republican Party was the dominant party after the Civil War because they had just defeated the Democratic South. In the 1870s and 1880s, a lot of African Americans in the South were Republicans, and very few whites. There were some, and a lot of these whites who became Republicans were angry about the class system of the South. They felt like Southern states were dominated by wealthy plantation owners, so people who formerly owned a lot of slaves. They controlled all of Southern politics, and a lot of poor Southern whites weren't happy with this. They did not like being sort of under the control of the elite in the South. So many of them also became Republicans, but not necessarily out of a desire for like equality, racial equality, but more of like a class thing where they felt resentment against the wealthy Democrats in the South. So the Republicans in the South were mostly African Americans, and Southern whites became very antagonistic towards white Republicans in the South. They viewed them as like traitors, as race traitors. So whenever Southern political leaders began to regain control of their Southern state after Reconstruction ended, that meant that they killed the Republican presence in their state. Republicans in Mississippi had no voice after 1890. Many of them were terrorized by groups like the KKK. But when a Southern state declared that it had been redeemed, that was that it had returned to one party rule, and that one party was the Democratic Party. So this begins happening in the early 1890s across the South, and these states began to rewrite their constitutions to make sure that African Americans could not vote, and to institute a formal system of racial segregation. So racial segregation was part of these state constitutions, but it actually got to the Supreme Court because there was a man named Homer Plessy, and he lived in Louisiana, and he was 1/8 Black. And he wanted to sort of test this segregation law and say, he was like, well, I'm only 1/8 Black, so I'm going to sit in the white section of this train car and see what happens, because I'm mostly white. So I just kind of want to test it and see what happens. So he was arrested because he apparently looked enough African American to be classified that way legally. He was arrested, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they were basically arguing two issues. One, some members of the Supreme Court and northern states were saying racial segregation is unconstitutional. It violates the 14th Amendment, which of course it does. So that was their first argument. Their other argument was, is this guy even legally Black? Like, he's 1/8 Black. Like, if we're now classifying people by race, we need to have some sort of structure for figuring out someone's legal racial classification. So this court case answered both of those questions. The first thing the court case, the first precedent that Plessy versus Ferguson established was the one drop rule. And that's basically how it sounds. The court said that if you have one drop of African American blood, then you are legally Black. And, you know, as I mentioned, this was the first time that people had to create legal definitions for race, because now race was determining one's rights in a particular state. So they had to say, well, race is something that is culturally constructed. It's not biologically constructed. So therefore, if a person, this actually happened, a man from India tested this law and basically said, anthropologists say that Indians are Caucasian by race. And so he was saying, well, that makes me Caucasian. And the Supreme Court said, no, race is also a cultural construct. And in the United States, you are legally classified as non-white. So anyway, this Plessy versus Ferguson established the one drop rule, meaning that any person who has one drop of Black blood would be legally defined as Black. The second and probably most important precedent that Plessy versus Ferguson established was the idea of separate but equal. And you've heard this term many, many times. And this was legal segregation. The Supreme Court said that as long as accommodations are equal for whites and Blacks, then it is legal to segregate. As we all know, those accommodations were never equal, but there's a bigger issue here. We will get to that in a couple of weeks, but just kind of keep in mind what it was that segregation actually meant. It wasn't about keeping Blacks and whites separate in all regards. It was about keeping them separate when they're doing the same task. So if an African American person is coming into your house to clean it, you don't have to be separate. If they're coming in your house to eat dinner with you, no, that can't happen in a racially segregated culture, because they're doing the same thing. You must separate people when they're eating. So restaurants had separate sections for whites and Blacks, water fountains, schools, but whites and Blacks were often together if they weren't doing the same thing. If there was a hierarchy to what they were doing, it was okay for them to be together. A great example is, this was actually in the textbook, but there was a church, and it was an all-white church, and a Black man walked into the church, and somebody was like, you know, boy, what are you doing here? This is a white church. And he's like, oh, I'm just here to mop the floors. And the guy said, oh, okay, fine, but you better not let me catch you praying. And that's just so bizarre. It's like, you can come in here if you're going to clean, but you can't come in here to pray, because that's what we're doing here. So if you want to pray, you got to go to a different church, separate church. So segregation was never designed to actually separate people. It was designed to create a hierarchy. It made poor whites above Blacks. So while a poor white could be more poor than an African American in the South, they were still above them because of segregation. Segregation gave them this higher level. They were allowed to go into the whites only section, and the Black people who might be more financially secure than them would not be able to. So it gave them a leg up even above people who were economically more prosperous. So that is the meaning and the purpose of segregation. It was to create hierarchy. So the Supreme Court upheld the segregation in the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case in the 1890s. And I don't worry about, you know, specific dates, but I do want y'all to know that this court case was in the 1890s, 1896, but just know 1890s. This established separate but equal, which lasted until 1964. It didn't last quite as long for schools, but throughout the entire society, it lasted until 1964. So the 1890s was significant for yet another reason, and it was the peak decade of lynching in American culture. The idea of lynching had been around for a long time, basically since, you know, the American colonies. People were hung for breaking laws. It was a sort of vigilante justice. But in the 1890s, it became something different. It became a racially motivated crime. And lynching was not only racially motivated by the 1890s, but it was also not used to punish criminals anymore. It was used to maintain white supremacy. So y'all, there was a video assigned for this week, a short one, and I definitely, it's very important that y'all watch that video. I'm not going to go over everything that it says here since you are watching that. The one thing I will say is the main purpose of lynching was to prevent voting. It was to prevent blacks from voting or from trying to vote, from trying to register to vote. It was also used to prevent blacks from trying to break the sort of cultural boundaries of segregation. So there were many tragic instances of African American, particularly men, who were lynched for maybe not like looking down when they passed a white person on the street. If they look them in the eye, that's basically them saying, I'm equal to you, I'm not going to look down. Many men were lynched for something like that. And if you think it sounds strange, like if you ever go up to a dog and it's a dog that you have established dominance over, and you're angry at that dog, the dog will look down. And that's their way of saying, like, I'm not challenging you, I'm deferring to you, and I'm deferring to your authority. If the dog looks you in the eye and stares at you, they're challenging you. They're being aggressive. You see dogs do this to each other. They'll sort of, they'll be aggressive towards each other, and then one of them will ultimately look down, and basically they accept their subordinate status. So this was kind of one thing that African Americans were supposed to do. They were supposed to look down when they pass someone on the street or in any social situation. Refusing to do so or refusing to step out of the way when a white person walked by could be grounds for lynching. Lynching was often also justified as a punishment for rape, but now historians have really uncovered these rape allegations, and like they weren't true most of the time. Oftentimes it was an African American man who might look at a white woman in a way that was seen as out of line or inappropriate, or they might say something that was seen as inappropriate. We'll talk about Emmett Till in a few weeks, but he was murdered for allegedly saying, hey baby, to a white woman. So this was common. African American men were targeted. They were seen as like monsters, like rapists, and white men felt like they had a duty to protect their communities by lynching African American men who maybe looked at a white woman in the wrong way. Lynching was often also used to prevent African Americans from having successful businesses, from competing successfully with white business owners. So if an African American man established a general store and he was putting a white business out of business or threatening a white business, he could be lynched for that, for competing successfully. So lynching was used to keep African Americans in a subordinate status, but the primary reason was to prevent them from voting or exerting any sort of political power, trying to exert political power. So while the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote, it was fairly meaningless because lynching was such a powerful tool and incredibly horrific. One thing you notice from photographs of lynchings is you see the murderers, you see them standing there looking at the camera. Oftentimes they're pointing to the victim and they're looking at the camera. That tells you that they weren't afraid of being prosecuted for murder. They're kind of proud of what they did. They were, kind of owning up to it. They were never prosecuted for murder. This was something that lasted far too long. It was not seen as a prosecutable crime. Nobody wanted to prosecute those who lynched a black man because they saw those lynchers as protectors of the white community, protectors of white women, protectors of white supremacy. So there wasn't a widespread resistance to it. As a matter of fact, lynchings became common community events in Southern towns. They were advertised like entertainment, advertised in newspapers and later radio, and people would come from surrounding towns to be a part of it and to watch it. Families would come, kids would come, and it was entertainment. It was a way for the white community to bond, and it included poor whites. So this is another thing that I'll kind of return to again. They were included in this. It gave them a leg up over African Americans. It made them a part of what was going on. So it basically separated them. They could be the spectators at a lynching, but only Black people could be the entertainment, which is so gruesome and so horrible to think of it that way, but that's how it was. It was a spectator event, and only Black people could be the entertainment, the victim. So lynchings were incredibly common. There were thousands and thousands before the federal government put a ban on lynching far too late, which we'll get to at a later time. The last thing I want to mention here, there's so much, but the last thing is the Wilmington insurrection. In the 1890s, the town of Wilmington, North Carolina, or this was actually prior to the 1890s, I'm sorry, 1880s, Wilmington, North Carolina elected several African Americans to positions of local power. So the mayor, different other local positions those positions were won by African Americans. This was before lynching kind of stopped African Americans from voting. So for many African Americans in Wilmington, North Carolina, this was a big success because they felt like, wow, we've actually, won. We've actually elected a lot of African Americans to local positions of power. A couple days later, the Wilmington insurrection occurred, and that involved armed mobs of white Wilmingtoners, people from Wilmington, who stormed the city, the main buildings of the city, and by force and by guns and by mob rule removed those African Americans from their positions of power. So they overthrew the mayor and all African Americans who had been elected to those positions. They basically, by gunpoint, said, you are no longer mayor. You are no longer chief of police. So this was a mob insurrection overthrowing a legally elected government in the United States. And it happened, and nothing about it. Can you imagine today if our city of Nashville elected a whole new group of leaders in a local election, and then several days later, a mob of angry people basically said, nope, you're not in this position anymore. Nope, you're not mayor. Nope, we're overthrowing you, and we're taking control of this government, even though the people of Nashville voted for that government. So this was the only instance of insurrection, violent insurrection, overthrow of a legally elected government in the United States. And I feel like more people should know about this. So just to kind of sum it up, by the 1890s, things in the South had gotten really bad for African Americans. Lynching became racially motivated. It became used in extremely high numbers. The 1890s was the peak decade of lynchings, mostly done to prevent African American power, whether that was political, economic, or cultural. It was designed to keep African Americans down. Voting rights had been removed by force. Segregation had been mandated by law and upheld by the Supreme Court, and the idea of separate but equal from the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. And racial definitions were classified and clarified in the legal system. You have to do that if you're dividing people by race legally. You have to define what's white, what's Black. So first time that became something that was part of the American legal and political system. Whenever I think of the 1890s, I just think of a really bad time. And this is one of the reasons why. In the South, things just got really bad. We will pick up there. We'll pick up here at another time with hopefully a happier topic. Thank you.